What does it really mean to live in the shadow of power? Most of us think of history as the story of a single great man or woman, someone who rises above the crowd, makes bold choices, and forever changes the world. But when you look closer, the truth is far more complicated. Behind every famous name are people whose stories rarely get told. Wives who managed households and reputations, children who carried impossible burdens, and descendants who bore both privilege and shame for generations. And few families illustrate this better than the Cromwells. When we hear the name Cromwell, one figure usually comes to mind: Oliver Cromwell, the soldier, the revolutionary, the Lord Protector who shook the foundations of monarchy in 17th century England. But his story cannot be understood without the family who shaped him, supported him, and in many cases outlived him. Their lives reveal a different kind of history, one woven through marriages, rivalries, and secrets that influenced not just private households, but also the fate of nations. Imagine being Richard Cromwell, suddenly thrust into leadership you never wanted, or Henry Cromwell, governing a land torn by conflict while trying to step out of your father's shadow. Think about Elizabeth Bourchier, Oliver's wife, who balanced her role as matriarch with the constant pressure of public scrutiny. And consider the generations that followed, some hiding their name, others using it as a badge of honor, all of them living with the weight of a legacy too heavy to ignore. This is not just the tale of one man, but of an entire lineage, a story that stretches from the civil wars to the present day. It is the story of ambition, trauma, survival, and the enduring power of family. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we dive into the hidden lives of the Cromwell family and explore how their legacy reshaped history in ways we often overlook. Thomas Cromwell is a name that most people immediately connect with the court of King Henry VIII. He was the master statesman who rose from modest origins to become one of the most powerful figures in Tudor England. His career was dazzling but also dangerous, and it ended on the scaffold in the year 1540. Because his story is so dramatic, it often eclipses the fact that the Cromwell name would resurface a century later in a very different but equally influential form. That later bearer of the name was Oliver Cromwell, who, unlike Thomas, did not serve a king but instead brought down one. To understand Oliver Cromwell only as a soldier, a politician, or a ruler is to miss a deeper dimension. His public career was never separate from the private sphere of his family. The Cromwell household, with its mix of hopes, anxieties, rivalries, and struggles, was the foundation from which his ambitions took shape. Family was both his anchor and his driving force. Oliver Cromwell was born in the year 1599 in Huntingdon, a market town in Cambridgeshire. He came from a branch of the Cromwell family that belonged to the lesser gentry. They were not nobles with great titles, nor were they impoverished commoners. Instead, they stood in the middle, landowners with some respect in their county, but far from the dazzling heights of courtly power. This position shaped Oliver's outlook from his earliest years. He was neither shut out from opportunity nor secure in privilege. He and his kin had to fight to keep their status intact, aware that fortunes could rise or fall in a single generation. The memory of Thomas Cromwell, Henry's fallen minister, loomed in the background. Though Oliver's family was only distantly related, the association with that name carried both pride and a reminder of danger. In Oliver's childhood, the family's financial position was fragile. His father, Robert Cromwell, had limited means, and the family relied on careful management of modest estates. They were surrounded by more powerful neighbors, and this sense of precariousness seeped into Oliver's mind. He learned that influence had to be secured, defended, and constantly nurtured. His mother, Elizabeth Stewart, came from a well-established family, and she carried with her a deep awareness of duty, piety, and family honor. From her, Oliver absorbed the belief that private life and public action could not be separated. To disappoint one's family was to wound the entire lineage, and to serve them faithfully was to find strength for broader ambitions. Oliver's education was shaped by these dynamics. He attended grammar school in Huntingdon, where he learned Latin, scripture, and the foundations of classical learning. But his schooling was not just about books. It was about preparing a young man to carry the expectations of his family into adulthood. He was sent to Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, a newly founded Puritan institution, which further imprinted upon him a religious seriousness that would later define his political vision. The choice of college was not accidental. His family's leanings toward reformist religion played a role, But so did the practical consideration that this was a place where a Cromwell could find opportunity without the heavy competition of more aristocratic peers. Every decision about his upbringing was touched by the awareness of status and survival. Oliver's early adulthood was not marked by triumph. He inherited his father's modest estates in his 20s, but debts and difficulties weighed heavily on him. Letters from the period reveal his anxiety over money and his fear of failing his family. At times he seemed on the brink of despair. These moments of insecurity were formative. They gave him a keen sense of how easily a family's position could slip away. Out of such fear grew his later determination to secure power so firmly that no Cromwell would again face the prospect of ruin. His marriage to Elizabeth Bourchier in 1620 married him into a family with stronger Puritan ties and somewhat greater resources, which provided stability, but the awareness of fragility never left him. Oliver was not an only child. His siblings, though far less remembered, played roles in his story. He had several sisters and a brother, and their fates were bound to the wider Cromwell struggle for recognition and survival. One sister, Elizabeth, married into the Whalley family, and through her Oliver was connected to influential networks that would later support his political career. Another sister, Margaret, faced the hardships of a marriage that did not secure the prosperity hoped for, reminding Oliver of the vulnerability of women in gentry families whose futures depended on alliances. His brother, Henry, lived more quietly, overshadowed by Oliver's rise, but his existence kept alive the sense that the Cromwell family was more than one man's story. Their combined fortunes and misfortunes created the backdrop against which Oliver measured his own responsibilities. The Cromwell household was not free from tensions. Lesser gentry families often experienced disputes over property, dowries, and inheritance. Oliver's awareness of these tensions within his own kin sharpened his political instincts. He knew that power was not abstract. It was about real land, real money, and real survival. Watching siblings and cousins struggle, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, taught him lessons about loyalty and competition. Family life was his first school of politics. He came to believe that a man must not only provide for his immediate kin, but also ensure that the entire lineage was shielded from decline. This sense of obligation became a powerful engine for his later actions on the national stage. As Oliver's career advanced during the crisis years of the 1630s and 1640s, the shadow of family never faded. When he entered Parliament in 1628, he was not yet the commanding figure of later years. He was a modest representative of Huntingdon, driven in part by his desire to protect the interests of his family and his neighbors. His speeches and votes reflected the anxieties of a man who knew what it was to live on the margin between comfort and collapse. His religious convictions were intense, but they were also tied to the hope that a godly society would secure stability for families like his own. When civil war broke out in 1642, Oliver's rise as a military commander astonished many. Yet beneath his military success was a man who carried his household with him in thought. He wrote letters home full of concern for his wife and children, revealing how much he feared leaving them vulnerable. His decisions on the battlefield were infused with the urgency of someone who felt that defeat would not just be a public disaster, but also a personal ruin. His siblings and their families were swept into his orbit, some gaining advantage from his prominence, others struggling to navigate the dangerous politics of the era. Oliver's rule as Lord Protector from 1653 to 1658 has been studied endlessly, but often with too little attention to the intimate roots of his ambition. The title itself was revealing. He was not called king, but protector, a word that evoked the role of a family guardian. To Oliver, leadership was not simply about holding office. It was about defending the household of the nation, much as he had felt called to defend the Cromwell household from decline. His style of governance, paternal and stern, mirrored the way he saw himself as head of his own family. The lives of his siblings during his protectorate shed further light. Some were drawn into positions of influence, while others lived quietly, overshadowed by his immense presence. Their fortunes rose and fell with his, proving once more that family was never far from the heart of politics. When Oliver died in 1658, the family's position crumbled quickly. His son Richard proved unable to hold power, and the Cromwell name once again faced the danger of obscurity. The very cycle that Oliver had feared in his youth seemed to return, underscoring how much of his drive had been about warding off this very outcome. To see Oliver Cromwell only as a soldier or statesman is to flatten his humanity. He was a man shaped by the expectations, fears, and struggles of his family. The Cromwell household, with its mix of pride and insecurity, gave him his sense of mission. His siblings, though less known, were part of the web of relations that taught him what it meant to struggle, to hope, and to protect. His ambition to reshape the nation grew not only from abstract religious zeal, but also from a deeply personal desire to secure a lasting legacy for his kin. Family was not just a backdrop. It was the pulse that ran through his entire life. Even as we remember him today, the echoes of those intimate dynamics remain. The Cromwell who became Lord Protector was never entirely beyond the Cromwell who feared family decline in Huntingdon. His rise was meteoric, but its fuel was the quiet, often painful world of siblings, parents, and kin. To look beyond the Lord Protector is to see the man whose politics were born in the cradle of family life, and whose story reminds us that even the grandest figures of history are never free from the bonds of blood and the demands of home. When Oliver Cromwell died in the autumn of the year 1658, the silence that followed his passing was heavy with uncertainty. The man who had risen from the fragile standing of minor gentry to the role of Lord Protector had carried with him not only the weight of a fractured nation, but also the hopes and anxieties of his household. For years he had held both together by force of will, but his death brought a reckoning. The question was not only what England would become, but also what the Cromwell family would be without him. In this moment, the private and the public once again intertwined. The family he had struggled so hard to defend now found themselves exposed, their fortunes tied to the same unstable political currents that had both elevated and threatened him. The children of Oliver Cromwell stepped into the light with varying degrees of readiness, each shaped by the burden of their father's name, each struggling to interpret what it meant to be a Cromwell after the Protector was gone. Richard Cromwell was the most immediately visible heir. Named as successor in Oliver's final days, he inherited the title of Lord Protector without having inherited the temperament that had made his father formidable. Richard was not a soldier, nor was he a commanding statesman. He was a gentle man, mild in manner, inclined more toward quiet domestic life than to the rough contests of war and politics. His upbringing had prepared him to be a landowner and a country gentleman, not the ruler of a nation still divided by civil war memories and religious strife. Yet history placed him in that impossible role. The Protectorate had been built around Oliver's personality, his iron faith, and his unyielding will. For Richard, stepping into that place was like trying to wear armor far too large. It rattled and sagged, exposing his vulnerability for all to see. From the beginning, Richard faced skepticism from the army, which had been Oliver's base of power. Soldiers who had followed his father with near-religious devotion saw little reason to give the same loyalty to a man they considered untested and uninspiring. In Parliament, too, his lack of experience and assertiveness left him open to manipulation and dismissal. Richard tried to manage through compromise, hoping to reconcile military and civilian authorities, but the very act of compromise seemed weak in a world where strength had been the coin of survival. His short tenure revealed not only the difficulties of leadership, but also the crushing burden of a famous name. To be Cromwell was both a privilege and a trap. The legacy of his father demanded greatness, but Richard's nature leaned toward modesty. In this mismatch lay the tragedy of his protectorate, which lasted less than a year before collapsing in 1659. He would be remembered not as a tyrant or a hero, but as Tumbledown Dick, a mocking nickname that revealed how swiftly a great inheritance could turn to ridicule. While Richard faltered at the center, his brother Henry carried a different weight in Ireland. Henry Cromwell had been sent there during his father's lifetime to govern and to consolidate the protectorate's authority. His work was less dramatic than Oliver's campaigns, but no less significant in shaping the family's legacy. Ireland was a land scarred by war, dispossession, and bitter divisions between Protestant settlers and the Catholic majority. Governing it was a task that required not only force but also tact. Henry approached this challenge with a distinct style. Unlike his father, who was often uncompromising, Henry showed a talent for moderation. He sought to reduce corruption, to calm the excesses of soldiers, and to establish something resembling stability. Henry's leadership in Ireland stands out because it reveals how different children of the same household responded to the demands of their lineage. Where Richard shrank under the shadow of expectation, Henry seemed to grow into a role that combined authority with pragmatism. He was not free from criticism. No Cromwell could be in that era, but but he managed to avoid the extremes of cruelty that many associated with the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland. His governance, though tied to the broader project of Protestant domination, was remembered by some as relatively humane in comparison to the policies of other rulers. In his efforts, we see the possibility of a Cromwell legacy less defined by turmoil and more by steady management. Yet history rarely rewards moderation. Henry's impact was overshadowed by the downfall of the Protectorate, and when the monarchy was restored in 1660, he, like his siblings, was forced into obscurity. Still, his years in Ireland demonstrate that the children of Oliver were not mere shadows of their father. They carried the family burden in varied ways, each shaped by personal temperament as much as by inherited duty. The Cromwell household, however, was never only about the sons. The daughters, often overlooked by history, played crucial roles in sustaining the family and at times in influencing events. Bridget, Oliver's eldest daughter, was married first to Henry Ireton, a prominent general of the parliamentary army, and after his death to Charles Fleetwood, another military commander. Through these marriages, Bridget became a bridge between the Cromwell family and the army elite. Her life reflected the alliances and sacrifices demanded of women in gentry families, where marriage was often as much about politics as about affection. Yet letters suggest that Bridget carried strength and conviction, sharing her father's Puritan zeal. Her presence in the household offered a sense of continuity, even as the family navigated the upheavals of civil war and regime change. Elizabeth, another daughter, married John Claypole, a man remembered for his gentleness and loyalty. Their relationship seems to have been affectionate, marked by Elizabeth's piety and John's devotion. She was deeply attached to her father, and contemporaries noted her grief at his death. In her, one sees the emotional heart of the Cromwell family, a reminder that behind the armor of politics lay real bonds of love and sorrow. Mary Cromwell, often described as spirited, married Thomas Bellasyse, later Earl Fauconberg, aligning the family with an old noble line. Her marriage reveals the ambition and adaptability of the Cromwells. By connecting with the aristocracy, the family sought to anchor themselves more securely in England's shifting social hierarchy. Mary's position during the Protectorate allowed her to move in high circles, and her personality seems to have combined wit with resilience. Frances Cromwell, the youngest daughter, made perhaps the most romantic alliance, marrying Robert Rich, heir to the Rich family. His early death left her widowed, but she later remarried Sir John Russell. Her story reflects the vulnerability and resilience of women in that period, whose lives were often redirected by events beyond their control. These daughters, along with their brothers, reveal the internal dynamics of the Cromwell family in the years after Oliver's rise. They were not simply passive witnesses, but active participants in the alliances, rivalries, and negotiations that shaped both their household and the wider political stage. Marriages were not just private unions. They were instruments of policy, ways of binding allies and strengthening positions. The Cromwell women carried forward their father's legacy in ways that were quieter than military victories, but no less important in the weaving of social and political networks. Among the siblings, rivalries inevitably arose. The collapse of Richard's protectorate created tensions within the family, as some believed he had squandered their father's achievements. Henry, with his record in Ireland, might have been a stronger candidate for leadership, but the structures of succession had already placed Richard in the position. Bridget and Mary, through their husbands, were tied to military and aristocratic factions that had their own views of the family's role. These divisions mirrored the larger fractures in English society, where no single vision of governance could unite the nation. The Cromwells were a family at once elevated and exposed, trying to navigate the treacherous waters left behind by their patriarch. The women of the family also bore the brunt of Restoration politics when Charles II returned to the throne. While Oliver's body was exhumed and symbolically executed, his daughters faced the social humiliation of being connected to a disgraced regime. Some retreated into private life, while others used the protection of their marriages to survive the shift in power. Their resilience testifies to the often unacknowledged strength of women in preserving family dignity in time. When we look at the children of Oliver Cromwell, we see not a single story, but a mosaic of responses to the demands of power. Richard embodied the tragedy of inheritance without preparation, showing how a great name can crush rather than elevate. Henry revealed the possibility of measured leadership, a path of service that was overshadowed by larger events but valuable in its own right. The daughters, through their marriages, alliances, and personal strength, sustained the family in ways that were less visible but deeply consequential. Together, they illustrate how the legacy of Oliver Cromwell was lived not only in parliaments and armies, but also in drawing rooms, nurseries, and the private spaces where family ties were tested by history. The Cromwell children remind us that power is never a solitary possession. It is always mediated through family, through relationships, through the burdens and opportunities passed from one generation to the next. Oliver's rise had been fueled by the desire to protect his kin from decline. In the lives of his children, we see both the fulfillment and the failure of that mission. They carried his name into the world, but each carried it differently, some with strength, some with sorrow, all with the weight of expectation that could never quite be met. Their story, like that of their father, is not just about politics. It is about the human drama of inheritance, identity, and resilience. To move beyond the figure of the Lord Protector is to recognize the family that stood with him and after him, shaping and being shaped by the turbulent century in which they lived. In their struggles, alliances, and rivalries, the Cromwell children reveal the enduring truth that history is never made by one man alone. It is woven by families, sustained by women, tested by brothers, and remembered in the echoes of both triumph and loss. In the story of Oliver Cromwell and his family, it is easy to be drawn toward the soldiers, the parliaments, and the rulers, to imagine that the making and unmaking of power was an exclusively male endeavor. Yet beneath the surface of battles and laws was another layer of labor, one that did not always leave records in statutes or military dispatches, but without which the Cromwell family would not have endured. The lives of wives, mothers, and matriarchs were not secondary to the grander narrative. They were its foundation. After the children of Oliver had stepped into their uneasy inheritance, what remained to hold the family's fragile reputation together were the women whose work was quieter but no less decisive. To understand the Cromwells beyond the Lord Protector, we must look closely at these women who shaped the household and by extension the nation. Elizabeth Bourchier, Oliver Cromwell's wife, has often been depicted as a silent figure, overshadowed by her husband's stern authority. Yet this impression is deceptive. She was in many respects the anchor of the Cromwell household. Born into the Bourchier family, with its strong Puritan connections and solid gentry standing, she brought not only dowry but also networks of influence to her marriage. When she wed Oliver in 1620, he was a man of modest means and uncertain prospects. The Bourchier connection provided him with stability, legitimacy, and an entry point into a wider circle of godly gentry who would later become crucial to his rise. Elizabeth's role was not confined to the domestic sphere. She managed estates, oversaw finances, and ensured that the Cromwell household projected the respectability required of a rising family. Her quiet governance of the private sphere was inseparable from Oliver's growing public presence. The 17th century was a time when reputation mattered as much as deeds. Gossip, rumor, and perception could make or break a man's standing. Elizabeth understood this. By keeping the household orderly, by presenting herself as the model of a godly wife, she helped to construct Oliver's public image as a man chosen by Providence. She was his partner in crafting a narrative of piety and discipline that resonated with the Puritan ethos of the age. Contemporaries may not have written treatises about her, but they noticed the stability of the Cromwell household, and that stability gave credibility to Oliver's claim that he could govern a nation. In a society where domestic virtue was seen as a reflection of divine favor, Elizabeth's management was itself a form of political work. Her role became even more pronounced as Oliver's power grew. When he assumed the title of Lord Protector, Elizabeth was thrust into a position no Englishwoman had occupied before. She was, in effect, the First Lady of a republic. Though she did not wear a crown, she inhabited a space akin to queenship. Royalists mocked her as Protectress Joan, sneering at her supposed lack of refinement, but such ridicule reveals more about the anxieties of her opponents than about her reality. Elizabeth was not a courtly ornament, but a matriarch whose authority within the household extended outward into politics. She received guests, managed petitions, and supervised the presentation of her daughters in marriages that were as much statecraft as family alliances. Behind the scenes of Oliver's protectorate, Elizabeth worked tirelessly to ensure that the Cromwell name carried the dignity required of rulers. Her contributions went beyond practical management. She was also a source of emotional strength. Oliver's letters to her, filled with tenderness and concern, reveal a marriage that was not merely functional but deeply affectionate. In moments of crisis, he leaned on her counsel and her prayers. The emotional labor she performed, listening, consoling, encouraging, was invisible to public eyes but essential to sustaining him through years of war and political strife. Without her steady presence, the burden of leadership might have broken him sooner. In this sense, Elizabeth Bourchier was as much a participant in the making of the Protectorate as the generals and councillors who filled its halls. The importance of women in the Cromwell circle extended beyond Elizabeth. Female relatives formed a network of influence that stretched across England and Ireland, shaping alliances and sustaining the family's social standing. Marriages of Cromwell daughters into families like the Iretons, Fleetwoods, and Fauconbergs were not accidents of affection alone. They were carefully aligned with political currents. Each daughter became a link in a chain that bound the Cromwells to military leaders, landed aristocrats, and political allies. These marriages were negotiations of power, and the women at the center of them were not simply pawns. They carried agency, managing households of their own, raising children who would inherit and extend the Cromwell legacy, and often acting as mediators between factions. Consider Bridget, Oliver's eldest daughter, who first married Henry Ireton. Ireton was not only a soldier, but also a key architect of the Commonwealth's political vision. Through Bridget, the Cromwell family was bound to him in both blood and policy. After Ireton's death, Bridget married Charles Fleetwood, another leading general. These marriages meant that Bridget lived at the very heart of the army political nexus. She was present in discussions, privy to debates, and by virtue of her relationships, a participant in shaping opinion. Royalists feared her influence, describing her as a woman of spirit and determination. Bridget's life demonstrates how the daughters of Oliver were not merely ornaments, but active forces within the political world their father had opened. Mary Cromwell, spirited and ambitious, entered the aristocratic circle through her marriage to Thomas Bellasyse, later Earl Fauconberg. This union was particularly notable because it represented a bridging of revolutionary and traditional elites. Mary's role was to help integrate the Cromwells into the fabric of established nobility, a delicate task that required tact and resilience. She moved in courtly spaces with a confidence that suggested she saw herself not as a mere appendage of her father's legacy, but as a woman capable of carrying her own weight in the high society of England. Elizabeth Claypole, remembered for her piety and gentleness, played a different role. She was her father's confidant, and contemporaries recorded that Oliver listened to her pleas for mercy on behalf of those facing punishment. In her, one sees the softer face of Cromwellian power, a channel through which compassion entered the often harsh realm of governance. Her early death was a blow to Oliver, who grieved her deeply. This loss reminds us of how central the emotional bonds of family were to his life. His authority, often depicted as ironclad, was in fact bound by threads of love and vulnerability, many of them woven by his daughters. The Cromwell women also maintained social standing during the years of collapse and restoration. After Oliver's death and Richard's fall, the family faced humiliation and danger. Royalists were eager to mock and punish them, and the restoration of Charles II brought the grotesque spectacle of Oliver's body being dug up and posthumously executed. In such a climate, it was the women who preserved what dignity they could. They managed estates, protected children, and negotiated survival in a society that had turned hostile. Some withdrew into private piety, while others leaned on the protection of their marriages to weather the storm. Their resilience ensured that, even in defeat, the Cromwell name did not vanish. It is easy to underestimate the strategic role of women in this period, because their work was often hidden from the official record. Yet when we look closely, we see that they were crucial players in the networks that sustained the Cromwell family. They hosted gatherings where alliances were discussed, wrote letters that carried influence, and maintained the bonds of kinship that underpinned politics. Their labor was not only emotional, but also logistical and diplomatic. They were the glue that held together a family that might otherwise have fractured under the pressures of civil war and shifting regimes. The story of Elizabeth Bourchier and her daughters illustrates the broader truth that the making of power is never the work of men alone. Behind the armies and parliaments were households, and within those households were women whose contributions were essential. They managed resources, shaped reputations, offered counsel, and bore the emotional burdens of uncertainty and loss. Their work was often thankless, but without it, the Cromwell experiment in governance could not have survived as long as it did. Looking at their legacy, we can see that the Cromwell women helped shape how the family was remembered. Their piety, their endurance, and their resilience softened the harsher image of Oliver as a stern general and ruler. They humanized the family, offering a narrative of devotion and sacrifice that continued even after political defeat. Later generations who looked back on the Cromwells often recalled not only the Iron Protector, but also the steadfast wife, the grieving daughter, the spirited sister. The memory of the family was, in part, the memory of its women. In the long term, their impact extended beyond immediate politics. They embodied a model of female participation in public life that, though constrained by gender roles of the time, demonstrated that women could shape events through household management, marriage alliances, and moral influence. They remind us that political history is incomplete without the private sphere, that the success of rulers often depends on the invisible work of those who sustain them. For Oliver Cromwell, that sustaining force was Elizabeth Bourchier and the circle of wives, mothers, and daughters who stood around him. Their presence ensured that his rise was possible, their labor made his rule endurable, and their resilience carried his name beyond his death. The Cromwell legacy, then, is not only the story of a man who toppled a king and ruled as protector. It is also the story of a family woven together by women whose strength, strategy, and love made survival possible. They remind us that history is not written solely in parliaments or on battlefields, but also in kitchens, nurseries, and letters, in the quiet but powerful work of maintaining households and nurturing relationships. Without them, the Cromwell name would have faded into the dust of Huntingdon. With them, it endured, remembered in both triumph and loss, carried forward by the very people who have too often been left in the margins of the story. The Cromwell family, held together in Oliver's lifetime by his will and Elizabeth Bourchier's careful stewardship, entered the Restoration years with the air of a clan both privileged and cursed. They had been rulers of England, Ireland, and Scotland, and then almost overnight they were outcasts. Their story after Oliver's death was not one of simple decline but of oscillation, with some branches fading into obscurity and others quietly adapting, their fortunes rising and falling in rhythm with the shadow cast by the Lord Protector. The wives and daughters had managed survival in the immediate aftermath, but the generations that followed carried scars of both greatness and disgrace. To understand their long legacy is to see how the Cromwell name itself became a force, sometimes a door opening, sometimes a wall closing, in the lives of their descendants. The trauma began at once. The exhumation of Oliver's body in 1661, dragged to Tyburn and subjected to a grotesque posthumous execution, was not just a symbolic act against him, but an assault on the family. It told every descendant that to bear the Cromwell name was to carry both the memory of power and the stigma of treason. For the children, watching the monarchy avenge itself on their father's corpse must have been a wound that never healed. Elizabeth Bourchier herself withdrew from public life, living quietly until her death in 1665, carrying with her the grief of both a widow and a matriarch whose family had been reduced to humiliation. Richard Cromwell, who had briefly worn the mantle of protector, lived long after the Restoration, surviving until the year 1712. His life became a study in obscurity. He spent time in exile on the continent, moving through France and Switzerland, a former ruler living as a private gentleman dependent on friends and sympathetic relatives. When he returned quietly to England under an assumed name, he was tolerated rather than celebrated, a reminder of a failed experiment most wished to forget. Yet his long life also meant that he bridged the gap between the revolutionary 17th century and the early 18th century. He was sometimes visited by curious figures who wanted to look upon the man who had once been the head of state, and in that curiosity we see the enduring fascination, even among those who disdained his father. Richard's children left little mark on history, and his line dwindled, but his existence as a survivor shows how the Cromwell legacy could be carried not only in triumph, but also in quiet endurance. Henry Cromwell's descendants fared differently. His governorship in Ireland had given him a more practical reputation, and he retired after the Restoration to his estates at Spinney Abbey in Cambridgeshire. There he lived until 1674, avoiding persecution and managing to pass on his property to his children. His line persisted, merging into the landed gentry and sustaining the Cromwell name in a more muted form. Through Henry, the family remained connected to local politics and society, a reminder that the Cromwells were not entirely erased from the English landscape. Yet for his children and grandchildren, the shadow of Oliver was always present. To be a Cromwell was to evoke memories of war, regicide, and Republican experiment, and how that memory was received depended on the politics of the moment. Mary Cromwell, through her marriage to Thomas Bellasyse, became part of the aristocratic Fauconberg family, and in her line the Cromwell blood mingled with noble heritage. This connection allowed the Cromwell legacy to seep into circles that had once despised Oliver, creating a curious blend of pride and discomfort. The descendants of Mary carried with them a diluted but persistent reminder that their lineage included both regicides and earls. The name Cromwell was not always carried openly in these branches, but the bloodline wove itself into the fabric of England's nobility in ways that ensured the protector's legacy could not be entirely excised. The psychological burden of such a name is hard to measure, but impossible to ignore. For some descendants, the association with Oliver opened doors. There were moments in English history, particularly in the 18th century, when admiration for the Civil War and Republican ideals resurfaced. During such times, to be a Cromwell could lend a certain heroic air, aligning the bearer with liberty and resistance to tyranny. Yet in other moments, particularly in times of royalist resurgence or national celebration of monarchy, the same name could be a liability. The family lived in the constant tension of being remembered for both greatness and infamy, and this dual inheritance shaped how later generations navigated their identities. One striking case is that of Oliver Cromwell's great-grandson, also named Oliver, who lived in the 18th century. He attempted to claim recognition and some measure of status from his ancestry, but he found that the name was both a lure and a trap. Admirers of Republican tradition celebrated him, but royalists mocked him, and he never achieved the prominence he sought. His life reveals how the Cromwell name could not be wielded lightly. It carried weight, but that weight was not easily controlled. To boast of Cromwell ancestry was to invite both applause and ridicule, often in equal measure. Other descendants chose quieter paths, integrating into local society and living as country gentlemen, clergy, or professionals. Their survival depended on balance, embracing enough of their heritage to honor family pride while avoiding too much display that might provoke suspicion or hostility. Over time, branches of the family dropped the Cromwell name altogether, adopting other surnames through marriage or inheritance, allowing them to blend into society without the burden of their ancestors' notoriety. Yet even in these cases, the bloodline remained, a hidden thread in the tapestry of English history. By the 19th century, with the Civil War centuries behind, the Cromwell name began to regain a measure of dignity. The age of Romanticism revived interest in great individuals who defied kings and transformed nations. Writers and thinkers revisited Oliver Cromwell's life, some portraying him as a hero of liberty, others as a tyrant, but nearly all acknowledging his significance. For descendants living in this period, the stigma of regicide was softened by the aura of historical importance. Some embraced their connection proudly, participating in commemorations and contributing family relics to exhibitions. The Cromwell name became less of a curse and more of a curiosity, a mark of distinction that could be claimed in a culture fascinated by genealogy and national heroes. At the same time, the trauma of earlier centuries still lingered. The family had lived for generations with the memory of disgrace, and this inheritance shaped their habits of caution. Even as the Victorian era celebrated Oliver as a man of destiny, his descendants carried the learned instinct to manage the name carefully, to deploy it strategically rather than flaunt it recklessly. Their relationship to the name reveals how generational trauma and privilege often coexist, shaping behavior long after the original events have passed. The Cromwell legacy even reached across the Atlantic. Some descendants emigrated, carrying the name into new contexts where its associations were different. In America, where Republican ideals were cherished, Cromwell ancestry could be celebrated with fewer reservations. The protector's image as a man who had challenged monarchy aligned with the values of the United States, and descendants who settled there sometimes found that their heritage granted them a kind of symbolic capital. The same name that had been dangerous in Restoration England could be a source of pride in a republic that defined itself in opposition to kings. In modern Britain, the Cromwell name still carries echoes. Streets, schools, and statues bear it, though not without controversy. For descendants living today, the surname can be both a conversation starter and a complicated inheritance. Some embrace it, participating in historical societies and preserving family artifacts. Others prefer to live quietly, wary of the polarizing figure who remains both admired and despised. The endurance of the name across 4 centuries speaks to the lasting impact of Oliver's life, but it also highlights how families live with history in deeply personal ways. There are surprising contemporary connections. The Cromwell bloodline has wound its way into unexpected corners of British society, touching figures in politics, the arts, and even royalty through distant marriages. While no direct line of Oliver survives today with great prominence, collateral branches persist, some still bearing the surname, others folded into different family trees. Their stories illustrate how the shadow of a great ancestor continues to shape identity, long after his bones have turned to dust. The lasting legacy of the Cromwell family invites broader reflection on the nature of power and inheritance. The trauma of disgrace, the privilege of a famous name, the oscillation between obscurity and prominence. All of these reveal how history is not simply a matter of events, but also of memory. Families carry history in their blood and in their names, and that inheritance can shape lives centuries later. The Cromwells remind us that to rise to great heights is to cast a shadow long after, and that shadow can nurture or blight those who walk beneath it. The Cromwell legacy is both extraordinary and ordinary. It is extraordinary in that one family's story became inseparable from the fate of a nation, shaping political institutions and cultural memory for centuries. It is ordinary in that it shows how families live with the consequences of their ancestors' choices, adapting, enduring, and negotiating identity in the face of shifting reputations. The wives, the children, the descendants, all were caught in the enduring shadow of Oliver Cromwell, each making sense of it in their own way. Their story is not just about the 17th century or the Protectorate. It is about the long tale of power, the persistence of memory, and the ways in which history continues to live in families, shaping the present as much as the past. The long and complicated shadow of the Cromwell family, stretching from the tumult of the 17th century to the quieter persistence of later centuries, forces us to reconsider how we understand history itself. Too often we isolate the individual, setting a man like Oliver Cromwell in a frame of singularity, as if his rise and rule could be explained by sheer will or destiny. Yet the closer we look, the more we see that his life, his decisions, and even the consequences that rippled outward through time were the product of a web of family connections, obligations, and struggles. From the anxieties of his childhood in Huntingdon, shaped by the precarious position of a gentry household, to the resilience of Elizabeth Bourchier and the steady presence of his children, to the descendants who carried both the privilege and trauma of his legacy, the Cromwell story is not the tale of one man, but of an entire family. When we place Oliver Cromwell back into that family context, our perception changes. He no longer appears as the stern lone ruler, a man apart from his age. Instead, he emerges as a figure deeply bound to the responsibilities of kinship, driven by the fear of decline and the hope of protection. His military campaigns, his political choices, and even his acceptance of the title of Lord Protector can be seen as extensions of the same instinct that once compelled him to preserve his modest inheritance and safeguard his household. What we call ambition was, at its root, a family instinct, the determination to prevent ruin and to secure a future. This perspective does not excuse the harsher aspects of his rule, but it does help us understand the human motives that powered them. The same shift in lens reshapes how we view the so-called failures of his children. Richard's inability to wield power is not simply weakness when seen in light of his father's towering shadow. It is the expression of a man born into expectations he did not choose. Henry's more measured approach in Ireland gains new significance when understood as part of a pattern where different children responded differently to the inheritance of family burden. The daughters, often left out of official histories, become essential once we recognize that marriage alliances, emotional support, and household management were as crucial to the family's survival as any speech in Parliament. History written only in terms of Oliver himself misses these dynamics, and by doing so, it misses the richness of the story. Family dynamics also help us see the wider impact of private life on national destiny. When Oliver leaned on Elizabeth Bourchier for counsel and comfort, when he listened to his daughter Elizabeth Claypole's pleas for mercy, these were not small domestic moments without consequence. They shaped decisions that affected the lives of thousands. The Protectorate was not simply forged in councils of war or state. It was sustained in kitchens and drawing rooms, in letters exchanged between spouses, in the grief of a father mourning a child. To divide private from public in history is to commit a false separation, for the two are always entangled. National destinies are shaped by the same loves, fears, and obligations that shape any family, only magnified by the stage of politics. The Cromwell descendants show us the endurance of these entanglements across generations. Trauma was not confined to Oliver's immediate children. The grotesque exhumation of his corpse was not just an insult to his memory, but a wound inflicted on his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who grew up knowing their name could provoke scorn or fear. At the same time, privilege persisted. The Cromwell surname, or even the whispered acknowledgement of Cromwell blood, carried a notoriety that could open doors in some contexts. Descendants navigated this strange inheritance for centuries, teaching us that the legacies of historical figures are not neat or contained. They spill across time, shaping lives long after the individual has gone. This realization challenges the way we often tell history. Traditional narratives look for heroes or villains, individuals who embody the story of an era. But the Cromwell lineage suggests something more complex. Families, not just individuals, create history. A single decision by Oliver reverberated through the lives of his children and grandchildren, altering their marriages, their reputations, their opportunities. In turn, their responses, whether Richard's retreat, Henry's governance, or Mary's integration into aristocracy, fed back into how the Cromwell name was remembered and judged. The interplay of these threads created a tapestry far richer than the portrait of a solitary Lord Protector. It is not only the Cromwells who illustrate this lesson. All great figures of history were embedded in families. Kings were sons before they were monarchs, queens were daughters and wives, generals were fathers and brothers. Their decisions were colored by private experiences, by loyalties and griefs that rarely make it into official documents. To recover this dimension is to move toward a more holistic view of history, one that sees the individual not as an isolated actor, but as part of a network of kinship and obligation. For Oliver Cromwell, the lesson is clear. His ambition, his sense of mission, his resolve in war, all can be traced back to the insecurities of his youth, the precariousness of his gentry household, the pressure of siblings struggling for survival, and the influence of a mother who instilled in him the conviction that family honor must be preserved at all costs. His decisions as protector were sustained by a wife who managed the domestic stage, by daughters who brokered alliances and softened his sternness, by sons who carried on his work in ways he could not control. His legacy, far from being the work of one man, was the product of an entire family working, suffering, and enduring together. Recognizing this does more than enrich our understanding of the Cromwells. It invites us to rethink history itself. We must broaden our lens beyond the towering silhouettes of individuals to include the quieter, often hidden lives of those who surrounded them. We must attend to the wives who kept households running, the daughters whose marriages linked factions, the sons who struggled under expectation, and the descendants who bore the shadow of a name. In doing so, we not only tell a fuller story but also a truer one, for no one makes history alone. The enduring power of family in history should not surprise us, yet it often does, because so much of traditional narrative writing has emphasized the individual. We are drawn to heroes, to singular figures who appear to bend the course of events by willpower. But even the greatest of these were never free from the bonds of family. They were made by them, supported by them, and sometimes undone by them. The Cromwell story is only one example, but it is a powerful one because it reveals both the glory and the burden of family inheritance. Oliver's rise was fueled by it, his children were tested by it, his descendants lived with it, and the legacy we inherit today is inseparable from it. As we look at the Cromwells across 4 centuries, from the anxious boy in Huntingdon to the descendants navigating their name in modern Britain, we are reminded that history is not simply the record of battles and laws, but also of marriages, households, and the unseen labor of kin. This recognition demands that we rethink how we study the past. It is not enough to ask what Oliver Cromwell did or what he believed. We must ask how his family shaped him, how he shaped them in return, and how together they shaped a nation. Only then can we see the full picture of power and its enduring shadow. The call, then, is to broaden our vision. Let us move beyond the mythology of individual heroes and villains, beyond the temptation to isolate the Lord Protector or the regicide, and instead place him back in the circle of his family, where he belongs. Let us recognize that Elizabeth Bourchier's management of the household was as important as Oliver's speeches in Parliament, That Richard's faltering was as much a part of the story as his father's triumphs, that the resilience of daughters and the endurance of descendants were central to the legacy. Let us see history not as the act of solitary figures, but as the weaving of family tapestries. By doing so, we learn something not only about the Cromwells, but about ourselves. For in every age, the power of family, its burdens, privileges, and enduring shadows, has shaped the course of events. Nations are built not only by rulers, but by households, by kinship networks that extend across time. The Cromwells teach us that to understand history, we must look not only at the battlefield and the council chamber, but also at the hearth, the marriage bed, and the lineage that carries memory forward. Oliver Cromwell's story, when told in this way, ceases to be the tale of a solitary protector and becomes instead the saga of a family whose fate was bound up with that of a nation. It is a story of triumph and trauma, of privilege and stigma, of endurance across centuries. And it is a reminder that history, at its deepest level, is always a family affair.